Alright, so we're going to finish off the puzzles and games chapter with a different type of math puzzle that's called a can-can. So a can-can is, we're back to the 3x3 grid, and you'll notice that there is some thick outlined rectangles all over the grid. And that's to separate the grid into these pieces. So you'll also notice that there are these numbers in each of the rectangles and a symbol. So there's a takeaway, so a minus sign, a divide sign, and in other ones we might have a plus or a times. So what's going to happen is we are looking for two numbers that when we subtract them, we get 1. Or for this rectangle, we're looking for two numbers that when we divide them, we get 3. And you'll notice in this one, there's just a 1 there, and it's just a single box. So we know that this one is the number 1. Okay. Now, just like the previous kind of puzzles that we looked over, in a 3x3 grid like this, we are going to be using the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And just like the previous puzzles, we can't repeat any numbers in the rows or the columns. Okay, so I started off with the 1 here, and now I'm going to look at each of the other rectangles and see if there's any other ones that I know will be correct. So for example, in this one, I can see 1 and it's a minus. So when I take away these two numbers, it's going to be 1. So I could have a 3 and a 2, or a 2 and a 3, or I could have a 2 and a 1, or a 1 and a 2. Now I do know that there's a 2 and a 3 here because I already have my 1. But I'm not sure which one is which. So I'm going to move on to a different rectangle. I'm going to try this one right here. So these two numbers, when you divide them, they equal 3. So when I divide 3 by 1, I get 3. So I know that in this square, or this square, is going to be a 3, and the other one is going to be a 1. Now I can't put a 1 here because I already have a 1. So I'm going to put a 3 there and a 1 right there. And that means that I know that this square is going to need to be a 2. Because I can only use the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And I have already used the 3 and the 1, so I'm left with the 2. So let's move on to a different rectangle. So right here, my two numbers, when I divide them, it equals 2. So 2 divided by 1 equals 2. And now I can see that I've got a 1, a 2, and now I just need my 3 right there. Now for this one, 1, when I take away the two numbers, it equals 1. So 3 take away 2 is 1. Or I could have looked at this and saw that it was the last number left. And of course, I'm just going to finish this off. 1, 2, and 3. And 1, 2, and 3. Alright, let's go to the rules. So I mentioned this in the previous slide that for a 3x3 grid, we're going to be using the numbers 1, 2, and 3. For a 4x4 grid, which means 4 squares across and 4 squares down, we're going to use the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have to look at each symbol and figure out which numbers go in each box. and make sure that no numbers repeat in the rows or columns. So let's do a practice one here. The best strategy is to look at each of these rectangles and see if there's any ones by themselves. So any single squares. So right here is the number 2. And I'm going to look at this next box right here. And it is the two numbers have to add to 3. So I know it's going to be a 1 and a 2. And because I already have a 2 here, I'm going to put a 1 right there. And just to continue this, if I've got a 1 and a 2 right here, the only number that can be right here is a 3. Now when I divide these two numbers, I'm supposed to get 3. So I know that 3 divided by 1 is 3. So what I would like you to do now is just finish off this puzzle. So pause the video and finish it off. Okay. So there's going to be a 2 there, and a 3, and a 3, and a 1. Alright, so now it's your turn. I'm going to ask you to pause the video, and I would like you to start off the Ken with our strategy from before. So starting off with this 2 because it's by itself. And I would like you to see if you can do the rest of the puzzle by yourself. Okay. So I'm going to look at this one, 2 divided by. So I know that one of these is going to be a 2, and one of these is going to be a 1. And then I can figure out this one is a 3, because 1, 2, and 3. And 3 divided by 1 is 3. And then I can finish it off. Alright, so let's move on to a more difficult one here. So now we're going to be solving a 4x4 Ken. So the rules are the same, and I would encourage you to follow the same strategy. So if you see any single squares, I want you to fill those in right now. And now we have to keep in mind that we're using the numbers 1, 2, 3, and the number 4. So I'm going to look at this one, the 2 divided by, because I could have a 4 divided by 2 or a 2 divided by 1. Now I don't actually know which one is which, because this could be a 4 and a 2, or it could be a 1 and a 2. But something that I do know is that in this one, my two numbers add up to 4. So of course I can't use a 2 and a 2 because that would be repeating, but I can use a 1 and a 3. So I'm going to be putting the 1, sorry, I don't know which one I can put in here, but I do know that one of them is going to be a 1 and one of them is going to be a 3. So that means I'm going to have a 1, a 3, a 2, and that means that right there is going to be a 4. Now, 4 divided by 2 is 2. And now I can move on to something else. So in this one right here, it's 12 times. So that means two numbers are going to be multiplying to 12. So there's going to be a 4 and a 3. So what that means is that one of these has a 3 in it, which means the 3 cannot be here. So the 3 must be there, and the 1 right there. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to look at each of my rectangles and start to think about which ones could be there. So for these two, I could have a 4 and a 3. For these two, I could have a 4 and a 2, or a 2 and a 1. I could have a 4 and a 3 here. And in this rectangle, I could have a 4 and a 1, or a 1 and a 4. But what does that tell me? So in this rectangle, I'm going to be using a 4, because a 4 and a 1 are the only ones that take away to number 3. So that means it's going to be a 3 right there, because I've already used the 4, and I know that a 4 and a 3 must be in this one. So then I can put a 4 right there, and the only number missing here is number 2, and then a 1. And what I would like you to do now is just pause the video and finish off this can-can. Okay, so just to finish it off, you'll notice that every row has numbers 1 through 4, and each column has numbers 1 through 4. So now it's your turn. I want you to just take your time, pause the video, and try to figure out this 4x4 can-can. I would encourage you to start off with the numbers that you do know, and then just think about what numbers could go in each rectangle. So go ahead and pause the video and finish it off. Alright. So if you did get stuck at some point, don't worry, because there's a lot of questions on the assignment that will just give you some practice. So I started off with my number 1 there and my 2 there. And then I saw that these two numbers had to be 3 and 2 because they're the only numbers that multiply to 6. So that means that I need a 4 right here, because that would finish off the row. And right here, I would have to put a 1 and a 2, because those are the only two numbers left to add to 3, because there's a 2. And then I would need to put a 4 and a 1, because those subtract to 3, and a 3 and a 2, and at this point I can just look at all the numbers that are left. So there's just a number 1 that's left there. Okay. So your homework is to go onto my RCOA and complete the chapter 1.3 homework assignment. And just special information, 2 of the questions on the chapter quiz will be very similar to the homework questions. So you'll be very familiar with those after you finish the assignment.